Welcome. My guest today is LeRiche, the Federal Civilian Field Chief Technology Officer and Solutions Architect at Palo Alto Networks Federal. Wayne, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you.
Let me set just a little bit of context for our discussion today.
Sure.
SASE, Secure Access Service Edge. It's one of the latest, I'll call it buzzwords, that has emerged as part of the move to zero trust we've seen across the federal government. Agencies are looking at how they can implement this approach to securing their networks and systems. And in fact, Gartner predicts that by 2025, at least 60% of all enterprises, federal, public, private sector, will have, quote, explicit strategies and timelines for SASE adoption, encompassing user, branch, and edge access. That's up from 10% in 2020. Now, back in 2020, Gartner also said that SASE will provide agility to cope with rapidly changing network and security conditions. They predict it will help manage complexity for network and security in a distributed solution. They talk about orchestration, maintaining a single security policy throughout a distributed environment. Zero trust network access will likely be a major feature in SASE deployment. All of these things back in 2020, here we are almost 4 years later, and they're starting to come true. I think SASE, as we see across a lot of agencies, when I talk to chief information officers, many times it comes up, oh, well, we're moving toward a SASE network approach. So Wayne, fill us in. Why does this make sense? Why are agencies really starting to say, look at SASE and go, okay, that's our future?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot around it, right? We can look at the OMB government mandates, right? M1926, M2209, logging, et cetera, right? So there's a push to move toward a zero trust architecture, but also remove some of the legacy technologies that were embedded in the government before. So things like TIC 3.0 are very important, and the SASE model really fits a lot of those use cases that were defined in M1926, years ago, as you mentioned. We also see a kind of a push for zero trust, and government agencies are really, I won't say they're struggling, but they're really looking at all the options of how to get to that zero trust architecture. And it can be very confusing, like in the whole realm of all the vendors speak and kind of the buzzwords of saying, you focus too much on like just the identity piece or the cloud piece, you kind of miss something in the middle. What SASE does is it really addresses a lot of use cases, not just the TIC 3.0 use cases, but anything that's emerging in those use cases. When we look at things like TIC, and it kind of outlines, as it being kind of a living document of these are the ways that we're going to address things in the future, things like IoT, machine learning and AI and things like that. What SASE does is it really sets a framework to get to that zero trust architecture just a little easier, right? It may not be a panacea for everything for zero trust, but it really does help government agencies move towards that zero trust architecture.
Let's take a half a step back and let's define maybe what the Secure Access Edge service is. A lot of people, it's not another product, buy our product, right? It's not another technology like AI people think about. Right. It's really an approach. You've mentioned a framework.
Sure. One of the main things about SASE is it's evolving, right? It started off as you had things like, before Zero Trust Network Access, they basically called it like VPN replacement. So you had private app access, or you had companies that were doing like secure internet gateway. So you were adding some security stacks to users as they kind of worked from home, et cetera. What SASE really does though is it brings in a bunch of different use cases under that umbrella. So we're looking at not only the users working from home, but also users working from a remote branch. So we're kind of cascading in there other things like cost savings, moving away from expensive MPLS-based networks, and different use cases. As applications move, from the data center to the cloud with SaaS adoption, things like that, SASE can really help address those. And then also on the flip side is the compliance piece, right? With SASE kind of being an as-a-service model, a more flexible and agile model, we can really adopt things like high-fidelity logging, which is outlined in some of the OMB mandates, like M2131 calls out logging, really robust logging, et cetera. We can do things like integrate with DHS CISA and what they call their cloud log aggregation warehouse. Since we're pulling all those logs in from different sources, stitching them together, normalizing them, and forwarding them on.
So again, let me just have a step back. It's a framework to apply certain technologies.
Sure.
And underneath the SASE umbrella, you may have multiple different sets of technologies that all kind of make up this framework.
Exactly.
You mentioned compliance piece, you mentioned logging, you mentioned moving away from MPLS. Does it also mean VPN? Right? We love to hate the VPN.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, VPN technology is still an important piece. It's more of moving away, not the underlying piece of the VPN, like we still need that encryption and kind of, two-factor authentication to get in there. But once we get in there, we need to apply other things to that connectivity, right? Now, it's not just it is a VPN replacement, but it does a lot more, like device compliance, following that user ID, making sure that user's persona is accessing the assets that it's supposed to. So when you have like a high value asset and you're doing a VPN, any user who has a login and password to get into that is going to be able to kind of access it. You might have something in front of that to do a second factor of authentication, but the chances are, once they're in, they can kind of do that lateral movement. So what we're trying to do with SASE and what we call ZTNA is really help fix that VPN, that legacy VPN problem.
I was about to say that the hopping is really what the problem is with VPNs. Once you're in, you're in.
Yes.
And a lot of times, if I compromise your credential, then I get in without calling out our friends at OPM too much. That's kind of what happened with the OPM data breach back in 2015.
Sure.
They got the credentials, they got in, and then they could just jump. What SASE and the whole idea of zero trust is, okay, if you beat this obstacle, I have another one ready for you. And if you beat that one, I have another one ready for you. And
Exactly.
the roles and responsibilities, the policies that are built around it. I think those are some of the benefits. What are there other benefits that maybe, as you talk to your federal customers, that you bring up?
For sure. I mean, with the Palo Alto solution, we really focus in on this notion of like a user ID, meaning that if I'm logging in from home, if I'm working from home, obviously I have to have a username and password or some multi-factor authentication, right? That's easy. But what happens when that user gets in the car and drives to the office? We see like this emergence of hybrid, return to office with work from home, right? So people are working from home certain days of the week and in the office. We really need to have a seamless experience for those users, meaning that not just from a security perspective, making sure that they are, have better security efficacy regardless of where they are, but when they're actually in the office, we still need to have some of that zero trust. And so what we've done, like in the past, if you had a VPN, maybe you were doing some type of logging for that VPN, when you come to the office, you're not going to VPN in, right? Because you're already behind a controlled asset. With what we're doing with SASE and ZTNA, zero trust, is really taking the best parts of that, doing things like device posture checking, and stitching that user ID to that new session now. Now that I'm not working from home on my Comcast or Verizon Fios, whatever, and I'm actually in the office, you still want to tie that user to that IP and that asset. And so that's one thing that we can really do from a securing perspective, but from a user experience perspective, SASE really brings that data plane and middle mile optimization, everything that we've done on the back end and all the billions that have been spent on kind of that cloud-derived, cloud-delivered architecture, it benefits the user. And so that's really the most important thing, I think. When I talk to government customers as well, security is important, but user experience is very important. And if it's not beneficial to the user, they're not going to consume it. They're not going to use it. They're going to find ways to get around it. So that's really one thing that we've worked very hard to bring to bear with the service.
The user experience piece is really important, but I want to just take a half a step back and ask you, many times what we still see about the biggest threat to agencies or probably any network is the person, right?
Yeah, sure.
I click on a link, all of a sudden it comes in my email and everything's exposed. What I think SASE is trying to do is add that layer of protection that maybe we haven't had before.
For sure.
Maybe it was a point solution. Okay, this database is really important, so we'll put more protections around it. But these databases over here are less important, and we won't. But what this is doing is spreading that security across the entire network, so you can't hop if you do get. You click on a link if you do have malware.
Exactly.
That's part of what we're seeing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, blocking lateral movement, things of that nature, or really integrating with what tools you already have, right?
Yep.
If a government agency has done their diligence, worked very hard to implement things like CAC cards, multi-factor authentication, phishing-resistant type, authentication, we want to integrate with that. And so the concepts I talked about, as far as like tying a user ID to a traffic flow, we can also use some of that multi-factor authentication that the government's already invested in as part of that decision-making process, right?
The user experience key piece when we talk about zero trust, and we hear this quite often, is don't forget about the user in zero trust.
Exactly,
You just can't lock everything down. Why is SASE, again, part of that user experience discussion? How does that kind of open the door to ensuring that you as the user doesn't find your way around the security, the security efforts?
Yeah, I would say it's the solution, the SASE solution itself, is very tunable, right? So we have obviously a spectrum of customers. Maybe some customers are really only focused on providing protections when their users are working from home and accessing the internet, right? So that anti-phishing type stuff. But for the government, to make it a more seamless and easy user experience, it's very tunable in the sense that we can set up to say, as soon as that device is booted up, the device is connected into the SASE service, right? So there's no, like, for lack of a better term, like a split tunneling. And even before that user puts their CAC card in, we can actually do some pre-logon and making sure that the device is up to snuff with its device posture, patches, maybe make sure the antivirus is turned on and up to date. Regardless if it's a Palo Alto antivirus, I can just make sure that it's up and running and has that right signature load on it. Once we do that and the user pops in their CAC card, they get their two-factor authentication. It doesn't matter if they're going to the cloud or going to a private app backhauled into the data center or chatting with someone, a colleague, or connecting to the internet. Really, that seamless kind of user experience with that one device, one load, and not having to kind of click into different clients to say, well, now I want to go access this thing at this data center, so I'm going to click on this VPN. And when I'm done with that, I got to make sure I click that off because I can't get to CNN or something like that now. So that's really what we're trying to bake in with the user experience. Another thing that we've really honed in on is kind of the emergence of machine learning and what we can do with the digital experience management, if you will. So imagine you have a help desk and you have users that are kind of deployed. What we can do with that agent, since it's resident on the actual end user's device, we can look for things like Wi-Fi. Maybe I was at my neighbor's house yesterday and connected to their Wi-Fi and came back and I'm still kind of tethered to it. My Wi-Fi is terrible. There's no way that a help desk guy could know that. But with kind of this emergence of the ZTNA client, we're getting that telemetry to say Wi-Fi is bad, or the middle mile is bad, or the ISP is bad. Something with every user on X ISP is starting to have problems. It's easier for that mean time to innocence for the operators to find.
And that then allows either the help desk or even the user to say, okay, I need to do something different. I need to improve my experience so I can serve the citizen, serve the business, meet my mission in a new way.
Exactly.
And without that, as you know,
yes,
things fall apart. Wayne, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation and we'll delve deeper into SASE.
Okay.
In the meantime, we'll take a break. You're listening to Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Wayne LeRiche, the Federal Civilian Field Chief Technology Officer and Solutions Architect at Palo Alto Networks Federal. Wayne, before break, we were talking a lot about SASE, Secure Access Services Edge. What is it? How does it work? Why is it important? How is it part of the zero trust world? Everything, I think, is a part of zero trust these days. Are agencies actually using this today, or is it a lot of, we'd like to use it, we're planning to use it, we would hope to use it one day, or is there some use cases?
There are definitely use cases, and I would say it's a spectrum, right? There are customers that we talk to that are like, well, I'm happy with my VPN solution, or it works just fine, and that's fine. Really the idea is to plant the seed of things are on the horizon, right? M2209 really calls out a lot of stuff that you can't do with legacy VPNs. So what we'll do is really look and give them architecture solutions that are very modular and very tunable to how, to their needs. One example is a large, executive level agency that has a worldwide presence. They've actually, over the last few years, they actually appointed a zero trust, lead architect. And that person was tasked with really finding solutions that they could use to kind of address a lot of these emerging zero trust technologies and, outcomes that they wanted. So what they did was ended up, starting with SASE and kind of like that piece of zero trust, which really helps them with access, helps that kind of, remote, user experience. And then also the branch, right? So rolling in some cost savings and aggregating some of that bandwidth that they used to spend a lot on. And eventually they were able to adopt this zero trust architecture. And the reason why this is important, I think, is because, while it's an emerging technology, it's being consumed. And customers like that I just talked about will come to us, will come to me and my team and say, well, M2131 was just dropped for logging. We need to have more efficacy and more fidelity in our logs. How are we going to get that from your service? And someone like me works with my product team to say, I have a government customer, they have a need, there's a mandate that's been put out, and we can adopt to that since it is derived as a service and delivered as a service. And we were able to basically bring that to bear as far as getting them that logging that they needed for a very specific application. So the adoption, while it's emerging and it's kind of nascent here, there are a number of customers that are using it. And again, the feedback that I get is in the discussions with these customers is always going back to that user experience, right? If it wasn't good for the user, it would not get adopted. And a lot of times they will start with, since it's as a service, they can kind of roll it in. They'll start with, a group of say 100, 500 users, whatever it might be, and eventually you scale up. And so it's not a one size fits all, obviously, right? But I think the way that we've done the architectures is really keeping that in mind, because we do service a number of other types of customers, very small customers, all the way to the very largest, Fortune 10 companies. So that's exactly kind of what we're trying to do with the government, is make it consumable to them, but also give them a voice to make sure that it meets their needs.
Is the implementation of SASE different for a small agency that has a footprint, maybe just in the US versus one that has a worldwide footprint? And what about if I have 100 people in my agency, or 10,000 or 50,000 people in my agency?
Yeah.
Or again, doesn't have to be one size fits all, as you said,
Sure.
but SASE is still SASE no matter how you carve the cake.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's really a testament to the way the consumption model is built, right? The idea in the end is it's just another consumption model for all the security pieces that we bring for zero trust. For that very small agency, it would be easy to implement a small set of users and test it out. Then they're not kind of dependent on their larger, parent agencies, or what they used to call the tie cap, where small agencies would actually connect into a larger agency. So you can find that balance. If it's a very large agency, like I said, what we'll do is we'll talk about maybe a pilot program where we say 100 users, 500 users, whatever it might be, really test out the service. And that's a heavy lift too, because we have to integrate to make sure that we meet some of those zero trust design goals, right? Things like multi-factor authentication, logging, connectivity to their private apps. All that takes a little bit of time. But what we found is, customers, they realize kind of the benefit of what this SASE service is, and they're willing to work with us to make sure that it works for a test, right? Once we get past that initial stage, it's very easy because it is all just software licenses now. And you already have kind of the infrastructure built, whether it was for 100 users, 500, or 500, or 5,000 users, right? So once we do that, then it's just a matter of kind of turning that dial up.
I was about to say, that's the as a service beauty. It's not like, oh, well, let's get into your data center and let us add more boxes.
For sure.
Like, that's the beauty not of the cloud, but of this approach as well. And I think as soon as folks see that, okay, I can start small, but going from 100 to 100,000 probably would cost me more, but it's not going to be all that huge of a lift. You mentioned one of the big benefits. You said they can aggregate some cost savings. Talk a little bit about why that's another area that agencies should keep in mind. It's not the driving factor, of course, but hey, if I could save some money, especially when we hear budgets are going to get tighter and potentially the cyber spigot may be slowed down from Congress.
Yeah, it's just another use case, right? Customers may have started out thinking of, pandemic, work from home, but as you start having return to office, return to like branches and whatnot, and then also with the emergence of, not to get too technical or in the weeds, but like there's the EIS contract that the government agencies follow, right?
Oh, we're all up on the EIS contract.
But they're negotiating prices on like legacy services and things like that. The idea is that if we can move them away from some of that model and say, take emergency response type agency that has something happens on the West Coast, they need to be there, they need to set up like offices in a short amount of time. You're not going to call your EIS contract requirement holder and say, I need to get a 10 gig circuit to this remote place for 6 weeks. With SASE, you can do that. You can get a business internet connection, drop it, and you're connected in just like you would be at a remote branch.
Is that because part of SASE is SD-WAN, software-defined?
Exactly, yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, the piece underneath.
Sure. The approach that we've taken is a layered approach, right? So you think of sort of very simply like a network as a service, but that network as a service is built on a massive tier 1 middle mile built for like elastic networking, and that really gives that user experience acceleration where if I'm working from DC and I fly to my office in LA, I'm not going to connect all the way back to DC. I'm going to connect to the nearest POP in LA. There is intelligence built into that piece for that network as a service piece. And additionally, that network as a service, we ride that tier 1 fiber. So when I'm working from home and I'm connecting to whatever these apps in the cloud, I'm going to be on net as long as possible before getting kind of pushed off to the standard network. And then there's another layer, which is that zero trust security layer. So all those things that we think about as far as securing users, kind of following zero trust, where we have, advanced threat prevention, URL filtering, the services that we need for those users that accidentally click on that link that kind of is a phishing or a watering hole or something like that. We really need to make sure that all those services are there, right? So these pieces kind of stacked together are really what makes that SASE service usable to that user.
Network as a service is another emerging technology or approach. I had a recent conversation with our friends at GSA about the EIS contract, and
sure.
That's one of the things they talked about is, there's a lot of agencies starting to ask for the network as a service for those reasons you just described. So it's good to hear it's not just the EIS contractors who are pushing from it. There's actually maybe real users of it. You mentioned a couple times the changing nature of federal work. It's work from home, hybrid, return to the office. All that kind of got pushed around for the Trusted Internet Connections, the TIC 3.0. CISA did a really nice job, I think, from what I've heard, is really recognizing all these different use cases. How does SASE fit in and really solve some of the problems that the old TIC had created?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, me personally, I was very fortunate that I came from a service provider. About 5 years ago, I was at Verizon and really focused on the legacy like TIC 2.2 services. And I kind of saw what was on the horizon, kind of the emerging TIC 3.0 push. And when I came to Palo Alto in 2019, M1926 was just released from GSA, and kind of following those guidelines, what we found is that the SASE model that we were building commercially really fit very well all of these TIC use cases that were outlined. So we worked really hard to meet those use cases, but also worked with our government partners like CISA to make sure that we were compliant with the things that they had on the horizon. And so what we did about 2.5 years ago was started in the DHS CISA pilot for what they call CLAW, which is the Cloud Log Aggregation Warehouse. So what customers would find is if they wanted to move to TIC 3.0, they were concerned that they were going to lose some of those services that they were getting from DHS. And what we did with kind of building this in the cloud and also connecting into DHS CISA's cloud, as far as the log aggregation warehouse, sharing of information and the like, is we were able to give them that feature parity, if you will, for lack of a better term. And then additionally, as DHS rolled out things like protective DNS, we were able to work with them to make sure that we could be a tenant in that as well.
I think one of the big concerns that I've heard from agencies about the initial tick use cases is, well, what's it mean for that tag back? Mm-hmm. And I think what you had described previously about, hey, I have an agency who needs to respond to something, set up an office for 6 weeks, solve that issue.
Yeah, exactly.
All of a sudden, I don't need to worry about going all the way back through the tick and coming back
Mm-hmm.
and the latency issues. That's, again, another big benefit and another reason why we've moved on from tick 1 and tick 2.
For sure.
Do agencies understand that part of the SASE implementation and the zero trust helps solve that long-standing latency challenge?
I think they're starting to understand it, like kind of the value and kind of the art of the possible, right? But they're really use case focused, and I don't blame them. They have a lot of stuff that they have to work on and try to figure out. So a lot of times they'll take one SASE use case and kind of implement that. Once they get past that, then they can start looking at doing a full view of all of their circuits, all of their branches, and figure out what kind of bandwidth they need, how they're going to kind of move to this SASE model. So it's happening, right?
All right. Which is great, because I think again, I talk to a lot of CIOs and they tell me, oh yeah, we're starting to go down that path, mm-hmm. which is the perfect segue. We have about a minute left, Wayne.
Okay.
And I've enjoyed our conversation. What's the big takeaway from our discussion today? What do you want to make sure that you leave our audience with when it comes to implementation of SASE? Again, we know like with every technology, no one's at 0, no one's at 100. You're always on some sort of spectrum. What should they keep in mind?
I would say to keep in mind the future proofing, if you will, like the technology integrations that SASE brings. As you kind of move to a zero trust model with something like SASE as kind of the North Star of that, right? As we, as technology vendors, kind of fold in new things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, things like DNS security or IoT, right? That's a big piece that maybe you had to have a separate, device on network to do that. As we build these new technologies into the cloud, it's easier to consume. So that's another thing that I think government executives should be thinking about is, how do I get to the next thing? Not just what's on the table right now.
And we know from the 2024 Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA guidance to agencies that just came out recently, mm-hmm. IoT is a big piece of that guidance. You have to know what your inventory is and how you're going to protect it. Wayne, but we're out of time, so we can talk about that next time you come on.
Perfect.
Let me thank my guest. Wayne LeRiche is the Federal Civilian Field Chief Technology Officer and Solutions Architect for Palo Alto Networks Federal. Wayne, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search innovation.